Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's toughest man, sat across from Johnny Carson, and suddenly his sentence stopped, his voice trembled, and tears began to fall. It was March 1982. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B in Burbank. Another Thursday night. The audience buzzed with excitement because tonight's guest was a legend, Clint Eastwood, the man with no name, Dirty Harry himself, the actor who had built an entire career on being unshakable. Johnny was in the middle of his opening monologue. Standard jokes about politics and California weather. The audience laughed on cue. Ed McMahon chuckled from his spot beside the desk. Doc Severinsen's band played the transitions perfectly. Everything was running like the well-oiled machine it had been for 20 years. Then Clint walked out. The audience erupted. Standing ovation before he even reached the chair. Clint did that characteristic half-smile, the one that suggested he found the whole thing slightly amusing but was too polite to say so. He shook Johnny's hand, settled into the orange guest chair, crossed one leg over the other. "Good to have you back," Johnny said, shuffling his blue cue cards. "Good to be here, Johnny." They fell into the familiar rhythm. Johnny asked about Clint's new film. Clint answered with his trademark economy of words. No wasted sentences, everything measured and controlled. The audience laughed when he delivered a dry observation about method actors. Johnny grinned and moved to his next card. "I want to ask you about something," Johnny said, his tone shifting slightly. "You've been making movies for what, 20 years now? And you've played some of the toughest characters in cinema. The man with no name. Dirty Harry. Characters who don't show emotion, who are all about strength and control." Clint nodded. "That's the image, yeah? Does that ever get difficult? Playing men who can't show weakness?" It was supposed to be a softball question. An easy setup for Clint to talk about his craft, maybe crack a joke about being typecast. Johnny was already glancing at his next card, ready to move the conversation along. But Clint didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands. His jaw tightened. When he looked back up, something in his eyes had changed. "You know, Johnny," Clint said, his voice quieter than it had been moments before. "I lost my father last month." The studio went silent. Johnny's hand stopped mid-reach for his coffee mug. Ed McMahon's smile faded. The audience, sensing a shift, leaned forward collectively. "I didn't know that," Johnny said softly. "I'm so sorry." Clint nodded once, sharply, like he was trying to contain something. "Clinton Eastwood Sr. He was 72. Heart attack. Quick. He was gone before anyone could." He stopped. Took a breath. "Before I could get there." Carson stopped mid-interview. The entire studio froze. Johnny set down his cue cards completely. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't why Clint Eastwood had come on the show. He was supposed to promote a movie, tell some behind-the-scenes stories, maybe do a light-hearted bit with Johnny. Not this. Never this. But something in the way Clint had said those words. The tightness in his voice, the way his hands had gripped the armrest of the chair, told Johnny that something real was happening. Something that transcended the show. "Clint," Johnny said, all traces of his host persona gone. "We don't have to talk about this if you don't want to." "No," Clint said, shaking his head. "No, I think I need to. If that's okay." Johnny glanced toward the control room, then back at Clint. "Take all the time you need." The cameras stayed rolling. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to figure out what to do. Fred de Cordova had his hand on the director's shoulder, whispering urgently. But Bobby Quinn, the director, just shook his head and kept the cameras on Clint's face. "Keep rolling," Fred finally said. "This is real. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Clinton Eastwood Sr. Clint rarely talked about his father publicly. Clinton Sr. was a man from a different era. Depression-era stock, a factory worker and steel worker who had moved his family around California looking for steady work during Clint's childhood. Oakland, Piedmont, Pacific Palisades. Never staying anywhere long. Never quite finding stability. Clinton Sr. was hard. Not cruel, but hard in the way men of that generation often were. He believed in work. In discipline. In not showing weakness. He didn't talk about feelings. He didn't do emotional displays. When Clint decided to pursue acting instead of a real job, his father didn't understand it. Didn't support it. Barely acknowledged it. For years, there was distance between them. Clint would visit when he could, but the conversations were always surface level. Weather. Sports. Work. Never anything deeper. Never the things that actually mattered. Even as Clint became successful, even as he became a movie star, a household name, one of the most famous actors in the world, his father remained distant. He'd watch Clint's movies, but he never said much about them. A grunt of acknowledgement. Maybe. It was all right. Never pride. Never. "I'm proud of you, son." Clint told himself it didn't matter. He'd made peace with having a father who couldn't express emotion. He'd built his whole career playing men just like Clinton Sr., strong, silent types who communicated through action rather than words. But it did matter. Of course it mattered. 3 weeks before his appearance on The Tonight Show, Clint got the call. His mother, Ruth, sobbing on the phone. Clinton Sr. had collapsed at home. Heart attack. Massive. The ambulance came, but it was already too late. Clint was on location in Wyoming, filming a western. He got on a plane immediately, but by the time he landed in Oakland, his father was already gone. Already at the funeral home. Already beyond reach. The funeral was small. Family and a few old friends from the steel mill. Clint gave a short eulogy, just a few sentences about his father's work ethic and dedication to his family. He didn't cry. Couldn't cry. He stood at the podium in his dark suit and spoke about Clinton Eastwood Sr. the way his father would have wanted, with control, with strength, with no weakness showing. Afterward, when he was helping his mother go through his father's things, Clint found something in his father's workshop. A scrapbook. Hidden behind some tools on a shelf. Inside were newspaper clippings. Magazine articles. Reviews of Clint's movies. Every single film from Rawhide through The Good, the Bad and the Ugly to Dirty Harry and beyond. Clinton Sr. had collected them all. Carefully cut out and pasted into this scrapbook. Some of the articles had notes in the margins in his father's handwriting. "Good scene here. He looks like me in this shot. Proud." Just that word. Proud. Written small in the corner of an article about High Plains Drifter. Clint had sat on the floor of that workshop holding the scrapbook, and for the first time since the funeral, he'd cried. His father had been proud. All those years. All that distance. And Clinton Sr. had been keeping track, paying attention, feeling pride he could never express out loud. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Now, sitting in Johnny Carson's guest chair with 300 people watching and cameras rolling live, Clint tried to tell this story. "My father wasn't a man who talked about feelings," Clint said, his voice starting to crack. "He came from a generation where men didn't do that. You worked. You provided. You didn't talk about being proud or—" He stopped. His hand came up to his face, covering his eyes. His shoulders shook once, twice. Hollywood's toughest man was breaking down on live television. The audience sat in absolute silence. Some were crying. Many had their hands over their mouths. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was witnessing something sacred and painful and real. Johnny Carson did something he'd done only a handful of times in 20 years of hosting. He stood up from behind his desk. Ed McMahon's eyes went wide. The cameras adjusted frantically. Johnny walked around the desk and sat on the edge of it, closer to Clint, abandoning the physical barrier that hosts always maintained. "Clint," Johnny said gently, "what did you want to say to him? If you could say anything now, what would it be?" Clint lowered his hand. His eyes were red. Tears were streaming down his face, Dirty Harry, crying openly in front of millions of people. I tell him. Clint's voice broke completely. He took a shuddering breath. I tell him that I knew. That I found the scrapbook. That I know he was proud even though he couldn't say it. And I tell him that I... He stopped again, fighting for control. That I loved him. I never said that to him. Not once. We weren't that kind of family. But I loved him and I wish I'd told him. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. The control room was in chaos. Commercial break was coming up in 90 seconds. They needed to wrap this. Get Clint composed. Move to a lighter segment. This was too raw, too real for late-night television. But Johnny Carson, without consulting anyone, made a decision. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a blue cue card, one of the cards he used for every show, with his handwritten notes and jokes. He turned it over to the blank side and pulled a pen from his desk. Clint, Johnny said, I want you to write it down. Right now. What you just said. Write it to your father. Clint looked at Johnny, confusion and grief warring on his face. What? Write it, Johnny repeated, handing him the card and pen. The words you wish you'd said. Put them down. Make them real. The cameras pushed in slightly. The audience barely breathed. Doc Severinsen and his band sat motionless on the bandstand. Clint took the card with trembling hands. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to write. The studio was so quiet you could hear the scratch of pen on paper. When Clint finished, he looked at what he'd written. Fresh tears fell onto the card, smudging the ink slightly. He handed it back to Johnny. Johnny read it silently. His own eyes filled with tears. He nodded once, then carefully folded the card and handed it back to Clint. Keep this, Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. Carry it with you. It's real now. You said it. It exists. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Clint clutched the cue card to his chest. He looked at Johnny, really looked at him, not as a talk show host but as one human being to another who understood grief and regret and all the words left unsaid. My father died when I was 8, Johnny said quietly. And I never got to tell him I loved him either. I never got to ask him the questions I wanted to ask. Never got to have the conversations I thought we'd have when I was older. So I understand what you're feeling. And I'm telling you right now, what you just wrote on that card is worth more than anything you could have said while he was alive. Because you meant it. Because it cost you something. Clint nodded, unable to speak, still holding the card against his heart. Johnny turned to face the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something we don't usually do. We're not going to commercial. We're not moving on to the next segment. I want everyone here, and everyone watching at home, to think about someone they love but haven't told. A father. A mother. Someone who might not be here tomorrow. And I want you to call them. Tonight. After this show ends. Don't wait. The audience began to applaud. Not the usual excited Tonight Show applause, but something deeper, slower, more reverent. People were standing. Many were openly weeping. The cameras captured it all, a studio full of strangers united in shared grief and recognition of their own unspoken words. Ed McMahon stood from his seat beside Johnny's desk, walked over, and placed a hand on Clint's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Doc Severinsen, from the bandstand, began playing something soft and gentle, not a planned song, just improvising from the heart. The orchestra followed his lead, creating a quiet instrumental moment that filled the studio with grace. Johnny sat back down at his desk, but he didn't pick up his cue cards. He just looked at Clint, who was composing himself, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. You okay? Johnny asked. Clint nodded. Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Johnny. For letting me. You don't need to thank me, Johnny said. That took more courage than any scene you've ever filmed. The commercial break finally came. When they returned, they talked about Clint's movie for 5 minutes, surface-level conversation that felt surreal after what had just happened. But it was necessary. A return to normalcy. A way to ground everyone again. When the show ended and the cameras stopped rolling, Johnny walked Clint backstage personally. They stood in the hallway outside Studio 6B, the sounds of the crew breaking down the set echoing around them. Keep that card, Johnny said again. It matters. Clint looked down at the folded blue cue card still in his hand, Johnny Carson's handwriting on one side, his own on the other. I will. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 23 years later, in 2005, when Clint Eastwood won the Academy Award for Best Director for $1 Million Baby, he gave his acceptance speech holding something in his left hand. The cameras caught glimpses of it, a folded, worn piece of blue paper. In interviews afterward, he never explained what it was. But those who had watched The Tonight Show that night in 1982 recognized it immediately. The cue card from Johnny Carson. The words he'd written to his father. Still carried. Still kept. Still real. And after Johnny Carson died in 2005, Clint Eastwood was one of the first people to call the Carson family. He told them about that night. About the card. About how Johnny's simple act of letting him grieve publicly had changed his understanding of strength and vulnerability. The card still exists. Clint has said he'll carry it until the day he dies. And then it will go to his own children, along with the scrapbook his father kept. A reminder that love doesn't always speak. But it always matters.